Life, it's full of choices. For example, one could drive this on a daily basis, or they could drive this. Putting aside the obvious packaging limitations, is it even practical to consider something like this for daily driving? You and I need to kick off today's case study with a bit of history. Why? The Z, whatever you want to call it, has a backstory unlike most cars on the planet. Been around 54 years. The generation before this was around for an unprecedented 13 years, and that is in a world where most generations of cars last for about 5 years. That was the Z34. This is the RZ34. Some say the R stands for refined because this is very much based on the car that it replaces. But we learned that a while ago, and that's where we go into a bit of history between you and I. We first saw the new then Z Proto in October of 2020. It's 4 years ago. And then we first drove what was the Z. Some thought it was the 400Z because that was the horsepower output of the twin-turbo V6. That was May of 2022. So they really took their time to bring this thing out. And here we are in now December of 2024 with the Nismo version. What makes the Nismo version? We're going to go through a lot of the bits that change it, but one of the biggest things, it's more output for the engine, but in the typical like Nismo fashion, it's not a huge amount of output different. It's only 20 more horsepower. Okay, now that we have the past out of the way, time to address the present and the future. So I have some sort of good news and definitively bad news. The sort of good news, this in the grand scheme of things, not the heaviest car on offer. 3,704 pounds, or depending on express your weights and measures, 1,655 kilograms. The definitively bad news, the heaviest Z on offer by a pretty wide margin. It is 218 pounds heavier than a manual transmission basic flavor Z. With that, Sport Plus mode, which is only on offer in the Nismo, doesn't. Oh, look at that! Brake traction on the back end. Wow, a little bit more than this Florida road can handle. There's a hell of a lot going on here. This does not have the same immediate feel as, say, a manual transmission Supra. Not by the numbers, by the feel, the seat of your pants. Now, why is that? Well, they fiddled with the wastegate, some of the engine cooling, the ignition timing, and obviously the throttle mapping to give us the Sport Plus mode. But does it feel, is it on par with some of its competition? That's something Nismo's, not just this Nismo. Oh my God, we'll get into this a bit later. Oh my God. But it's still a hell of a quick car. The transmission, I don't want to be the typical, oh my God, it doesn't have a manual transmission. You know what, we're going to get to that later. Overall, the 9-speed, it kind of works. It's a cousin of a Mercedes transmission, which also kind of works, which is one of the better ones out there when you compare to other 9-speed transmissions. But why is that? Because this one and the ones over in the Mercedes, they don't hunt for gears. They pick the right gear, stick on it, and it actually works with the personality of the engine they're trying to pair it with. In this case, they've had this transmission around for many years. One of the benefits of building on what you have that came before it, we'll get to why that's a bad thing a bit later. Now, if you're familiar with our Living With series, you know that this is the most difficult part of the episode for most cars, not in this case because for the most part it is reliable, even the car it replaces. Now, most of the issues that affect this car affect the generation that came before it, and in digging through my moles at Nissan USA, some dealers, as well as a lot of friends of mine that own these cars, not this generation, the previous generation, there are basically 4 big ones that come up. With this one, it's the lurch in the transmission, the automatic transmission, and I notice it even in this car. I think it's a programming deal, maybe they can address it, but there are a lot of complaints. Then there are complaints with the suspension. I don't think it's an issue in terms of, oh my God, it's broken. It's just tuned the wrong way. We've learned that when we first drove it back in 2022, And yeah, you and I could beat up Nissan about that, but there are really two solutions. There's this is a solution from the complaint we had in 2022, and most people, if I'm honest, that buy these things, they mod them, so they're going to change the suspension anyway. Then we get into a very sensitive parking sensor. I notice it in this one, I've noticed it in every one of them I've driven, and my friends that have these things, same thing. And then there's something that is just beyond annoying, creaking of the interior. I noticed it, I've got a bunch of friends that have the Z34, and it's like the seats aren't screwed in the right way, or the pieces on the inside aren't fitted the right way. It's not that it's a cheap car or the build quality is bad. Like, a lot of people can complain about Nissans, but that really is the transmission in like Rogues. Nissans, they're screwed together pretty well, whether you like it or not, and something about the interior just needs a thorough going through. But aside from that, these things, bulletproof. Over the years, you and I have pissed and moaned about not enough of a difference between run-of-the-mill Nissans and Nismos. But when it comes to driving dynamics, specifically suspension tuning, that's where you get the biggest difference. One of the complaints when we first drove this car, the suspension, the setup just didn't work for a sports car. It felt like the car was heavy, and it really wasn't. The Nismo Tune absolutely addresses that, and I will prove it right here. Oh my God. Oh! This would have been better doing this in California, but the reality is there are no turns in Florida, so I had to find the bumpiest road on offer. Okay, so that's all fine and good, but why did the car do that? Obviously, they've changed the tune of the double wishbones in the front, the multi-link in the back. They've changed the brakes as well. The brakes significantly larger. One of the things that we found was a problem on the basic car. The brakes, especially in the front, super small, like 12.45 inches in diameter. Ridiculous. Now we're over 15 here with 4 piston calipers in the front. So the brakes, they kind of match the thrust of the engine, especially in this with 20 more horsepower. Another fascinating choice in the Nismo Tune are the tires. They could have went with some crazy 30 series tires. They ended up going with 40 series. And if you look at the tire, it kind of looks out of place in a sports car because there's so much sidewall, almost like an off-road car. But by doing that, it makes the Nismo a more usable vehicle on roads like this, rather than just being a track tool. I think the only way to put it, the Nismo, while much stiffer and most of your girlfriends, grandmothers, and mothers will not appreciate the way this car drives, this is the way the basic Z should have been, and the Nismo should have been even more extreme than this. And it's here we come to a painful discussion about numbers. Let's start with the cost. These, when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, are relatively inexpensive, at least the basic models. They start around $43,000, but most of them you see on the road are in the mid-50s. The one you are looking at, not cheap at all. It has a base price of around $65,000, which you are looking at with very few options, and you got to pay extra for like the floor mats. $68,000. Now, how does that impact sales? A lot. You see, these, there's no nice way to put this, they don't sell well. In 2022, Toyota sold about 5,000 Toyota Supras. In the same 2022, Nissan sold 263 of these, 4 in Canada. But let's be fair, 2023, that was a full model year. They sold something like 1,700. Toyota sold about double that. But that really isn't the problem of this car or the Supra. The problem is called the Corvette. You see, in 2022, they sold something like 25,000, almost 26,000 Corvettes. In 2023, they sold almost 54,000 Corvettes. As a basic comparison, that is within 22 units of the best year ever of Corvette selling. Now, why is that? This, as we've said, is a $68,000 car, even if we've got the most basic one with a couple options, 50 grand. A Corvette started famously in 2020 at $60,000. Now the basic price is around $68,000, $69,000. So I've always told you, someone that has the money or the credit for a $55,000 car, they're probably going to get the $60,000 car. They can afford it. But when it comes to resale, that really tells the story. You see, this, in terms of resale, there aren't enough sales to determine the market value. So you have to look at what the transaction prices are. And in talking to a couple of dealers, as well as looking online, these are selling between $33,000 and $35,000. For the basic car, I haven't seen any of the Nismos on offer in terms of the used market. But that only tells a third of the story. The Toyota Supra, in comparing apples to apples, 6-cylinder to 6-cylinder, $55,000 base price. The car 2 years on has a resale of around $42,000 to $43,000, so it retains 82% of its value. Then we get to the Corvette. The Corvette, that has a resale of a 2022 model year car. That one is $59,000 for a car that had a base price of $60,900, translated 98% return on your money. Now, will this crazy return continue? I'm willing to bet no, because now you could walk into a Corvette dealer and get a significant discount on a basic C8, something like $10,000. Even Z06s, those are starting to get discounted. Don't expect a discount on a ZR1. That being the case, 78% return if we go by some of the spotty market data we got here. So overall, from a future perspective, in terms of resale, even the Supra is better than this, but the problem for both is something from Detroit. Let's play a little game, shall we? We'll call it the good, bad, and ugly of interior design. Let's start with the good. This, not claustrophobic like any Supra, although you definitely need some sort of roof option up there. The bad, that shifter, it is abysmal. That does not belong in a sports car. It belongs in a crossover. Keep it in a crossover. I'm not going to call them ugly, but odd combo. The seats, Recaro seats, or shall I say half Recaro seats. See, what they do is they kind of sandbag you. The backs of the seats are like the Recaros you've seen in other like OEM type applications. Mercedes, remember the Evora back in the day. But the bottoms of the seats, that is the basic seat cushion you see in the most bargain flavor of the Z. Overall, this is a lovely place to be. Granted, very familiar because it's almost identical to the Z in which it replaces, but we discussed that when we first drove this Z, and you thought roads in Florida were perfect. It's just a very familiar place. Overall, I like some of the design touches here, although some of them are shared with other Zs, but notice they kept some specific Z items which carry their way over into the Nismo, like the HVAC knobs. Thank you very, very much. Or everything in this car is black. How about a different color than black, especially if we're going to live with something that doesn't have an opening roof? Okay, so putting aside our little game, what am I trying to say here? All of the small design bits on the inside of the car, one of the high points of this change into the RZ34. Before you and I wrap for the day, I feel compelled to share a bit of bias. For a long while now, I have been a Z car fan, to the point that when I have the space, I will absolutely have a Z32 in my collection. Now, that being the case, I feel we should appreciate that this exists even in its very flawed form. It's not a bad car, it's just in a world where the competition is so stiff. And the reality is that competition comes from one place because it's such a moonshot. That's what I called the Corvette in our first C8 episode. And it's unfortunate for this car, the pricing is so close, so that's where we have to get to the wish list. Number one, this, as we've discussed, should be the base car. $65,000, way too far off the plantation. This needs to be, and maybe 50 is fine, but 65 for a Z in a world where a Corvette exists, not at all possible. Number two, you need a GT3 type version. Something that is absolutely manual. You cannot have the more powerful version and have an automatic. People that want these cars, they want the more analog experience. So I'm thinking it's a GT3 version, we call it whatever you want, and then have much more power, something closer to 500 horsepower, maybe a glass roof on the base car, and then definitely tune the suspension like this or above. And that car, even at 65, 70 grand, would be so different. And I think that would go well into the collector car world, especially be the affordable halo car that Nissan needs. And then second, you know, I love brother Alfonso. He was one of the 3 people that made this car come to life. You guys probably have heard of Tamura-san, but you haven't heard of Dan Pass. Dan Pass, he was the PR guy here in the US. He was one of the 3 people that really pushed to bring this car to life, so huge thanks to him. And they even ran into some problems. They got the car, but as we learned from Alfonso, they didn't do a roof option. These, I feel, really do need a roof option because it's one of the things that makes the Corvette, I'd say, more available to more people because they like the idea of having an open-top car without committing to a convertible. Okay, so that's my humble wish list if I was the emperor of the Nissan world. This is the point of the episode I traditionally turn around to you guys to opine in the comments below, but here it's significantly more important because this car is significantly more important to us. And yes, we can sit here and piss and moan about the things we don't like about it, but it's here. A car company actually listened to us and brought us a car that is not a baby buggy and does have a manual transmission asterisk in certain builds. So, comments below. How can we fix it? Because we don't want it to go away, even though you still want to piss and moan about things. And with that, if you found this episode fascinating, I would highly suggest you watch our Living With episode with its direct competitor that does have a manual transmission. You can see that episode here. Until I see you in the next episode, bis später.